Hello Earthlings, you're listening to the Environment and Science podcast, The Earth Show. Hello and welcome to The Earth Show here with me, Elysia. This is the show where we talk about all things environmental, science and sustainability related, from the biggest issues across our globe to what's going on right here in our local community. Now, wildlife is a word that is on the tip of everyone's tongue when we think about the planet and the challenges it is facing. Globally, it is reported by the World Wildlife Fund that since 1970 alone, the world has seen a 73% decline in the average size of global wildlife. It's an unfathomably large figure for such a short space of time, but one that clearly highlights the scale of the impact human activity is having on those we share our home with. And with 1 in 6 species in Great Britain at risk of being lost, according to the 2023 State of Nature report, work to restore and protect our natural environment and native species is now more urgent and important than it's ever been before. And so, in response to this, across the UK, many organisations are working tirelessly on just this, on both a local and national scale. And I'm delighted to be joined by Mélusine Velde from the Cheshire Wildlife Trust today, telling us all about the work of the Trust, its importance, and what you can do to help. To introduce her properly, Mélusine grew up between France and the US and is now based in the UK after coming over to do her Masters in Ecology and Conservation. She moved up to Chester to be near friends and ended up getting a job at the Cheshire Wildlife Trust, where she advocates for wildlife when it's threatened by development. When she's not trying to save nature, you can find her on hikes in North Wales, bouldering at the climbing gym, or doing crafts at home. Welcome to the show, Mélusine.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. This is really exciting.
It's lovely to have you here, and it's a slightly unconventional setup. We must tell everyone.
In case there are any issues.
Yeah, we're normally in the studio, but today we're had a slight relocation. It's safe to say to a different room, but it's cool. It's the first time for everyone in this case, which is kind of nice.
Exactly.
I believe it's your first time on the radio.
Yeah, I've been interviewed on the radio where they called me,
Cool.
but not in a kind of recorded way. Also,
yeah, we can't quite call it a studio, but it's like a I don't know how to describe it, like a portable studio kind of setup, isn't it today? But it's great to have you here, and I'm excited to be talking about what you do in your role and all your work, which is going to be really interesting for our listeners to hear about because it's directly in our local area too, which is really cool. But first, I want to talk about your intro because I love it when people put in their intros like other things other than their work, which obviously everyone's work is super cool and interesting, but your hobbies are really cool too. You do bouldering.
Yeah, I started during my Masters. Some friends got me into it, and it's been a really fun way to stay active and get stronger, which I was not before.
It's insane the like upper body strength you need for bouldering.
You need, but also that you get when you boulder.
Do you think you build it up quite quickly?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a really fun way to do it.
I was just say I kind of, but I mean, I always knew about bouldering and climbing, and like, sure, I tried it a tiny weeny bit before, like a birthday party growing up or something. But like the Olympics, I think really brought it into the limelight.
And several next levels.
I know. Yeah. I don't even understand how they like get the body. They're like upside down and then they're like over here, and it doesn't even seem like they've got anything to hold on to.
Nope.
But yeah, the fact you do bouldering is pretty impressive.
It's a fun hobby. It's a good way to stay active.
Have you ever done it do you do it inside or do you ever do it outside?
I mostly do it in the gym. I go to the gym in North Wales, and then I've been out a few times with friends. I actually went out in North Wales last weekend with some friends, and it's so much fun to be outside, especially when it's a beautiful day and in a beautiful place.
So obviously you've said you go out hiking into North Wales and things like that. I guess part of like wanting to spend time outside is that you enjoy being in nature.
Yes, absolutely.
Does that fold into like how you ended up in the kind of career and doing that Masters that you did?
Yes, 100%. It's funny, so I grew up in Chicago, which is one of the biggest cities in the US. but I grew up in a neighborhood that's just next to a really nice park, and the city of Chicago is on the lake, Lake Michigan. And so I kind of grew up going on walks a lot, especially my mom. And the park district in Chicago has done a really good job of kind of rewilding, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. And so I kind of started seeing nature in a much more urban context. And then I decided to study kind of environmental science in general at uni. I thought I was going to go more into kind of geology and biology. Realized I hated chemistry and that I did not want to do more chemistry courses. And so I kind of pivoted into ecology and conservation. Realized it was much more fun, quite a bit easier, a bit less technical. And then also it was just such a good crowd of people. And this is something I found through my studies and in my current job now, and kind of throughout my short early career, is that people who work in conservation are the best. It's just it's a group of really passionate and really dedicated people, and it's not a career that pays very much, so people are really there because they want to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I've been really lucky to have quite a few people working in that sector on this show. And yeah, it is about the passion, and everyone I've had on is absolutely lovely. Yeah. So I completely get what you're saying about the people who work in that sector. For people listening to the show who know all the words like ecology, conservation, but maybe don't know exactly what that entails, do you have like a kind of high-level overview as to what kind of things you were studying and looking at?
So actually, I've had a few debates in the last few months, or discussions with people about what these terms actually mean. And even within the conservation sector, I've realized that people have different definitions based on the work that they do. And so I come from a pretty technical background. I started in research. I did, my master's was a research master's. And so I come from a very technical background, very based in science and evidence. And whereas I have some colleagues who work a lot more with communities. And so their approach is a lot more through like the personal connection with nature, and it's not quite as technical. And so it means that we're kind of approaching these concepts differently. So I can give you my definitions, but I'm sure that my colleagues and friends would have different definitions of their own. But to me, nature is kind of everything that isn't man-made. And then so that kind of extends into the natural world or the natural environment around us. So that's kind of the plants and animals, but it also kind of has to do with the weather and the soils and all these different aspects, things that we don't necessarily think about as nature, but definitely have a really big influence on kind of the overall systems. And then I think the term that is most applicable to my job, I guess, in my organization is wildlife. And so that, again, is very broad, but that's kind of it's the flora and fauna, I think, the plants and animals that are around. And a lot of it has to do with the way that they interact and they live together and depend on each other. And so the focus of conservation is trying to protect nature and protect wildlife. And it's also protecting specifically the ways in which they interact, because it's a really complex system. Everything is really interconnected, which means that if you lose one element, it can affect a lot of different elements and kind of throw things off balance, because at the end of the day, it hinges on being, really a really tight balance. Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear like what you started with there, where you said that different people in the sector would have a different definition depending on, I guess, what angle they're coming from.
Yeah.
Because people often think of a definition as kind of almost being like a black and white thing, like it's just a fact kind of statement, like that you can look up in a dictionary.
I'm sure the dictionary will have a definition too.
But it's interesting though, like how it's applied to different contexts, like you were saying, which probably like a lot of us, like I don't think I had really considered before. So it's really interesting that you said that. And then obviously you were going on to say how everything's like so interlinked and everything, which is something that I love hearing about people talk about, because I think that's like one of the things that I guess more recent generations of humans have kind of lost that understanding of how everything's interconnected and we're also connected into that.
Yeah.
And I think that nowadays people have quite a separation of nature and themselves.
Absolutely.
But actually, yeah, we fundamentally are connected, and everything we do impacts the rest of the nature around us, and vice versa, for things like our food, our water, everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it's really good to hear you like bringing that point home again, which obviously you're going to have such a good understanding of from your work in the sector, your masters, and yeah, I can't wait to get talking more about this throughout the show. So we'll wrap the first section up now, and then we'll come back and we'll start talking about what you're doing in your role, who the Cheshire Wildlife Trust are, the kind of work they're involved with, and why it's really important. So we'll be back with you just after the break. Hello and welcome back to the Earth Show here with me, Elysia, joined today by Mélusine from the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. We've already had a nice introduction to you, a bit of your background, how you kind of got interested in the sector, what you interpret kind of the environment, nature, ecology to be, and as you raised a really interesting point, which was that actually it's different to different people, which is a really thought-provoking thing, I think, for a lot of us, because we think about it in one quite linear way, perhaps. But on to the theme of today's show, which is obviously talking about the work of the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So we obviously need to start with talking about who the Cheshire Wildlife Trust actually are. Who are they and what do they do?
So we are an independent charity, a local independent charity, based in Cheshire, obviously. We're kind of part of a larger movement of wildlife trusts. So there's kind of a team operating at the national level, and then there's about one trust for every county, where they are usually one of the main conservation organizations at that level. And so we do all sorts of things. A big part of what we do is nature recovery, and so that can be, like planting trees and restoring meadows, and doing the actual physical grunt work of managing nature reserves, and doing habitat restoration. But then we have a whole throughout our teams, we have community officers who work with people to try to get people more interested in wildlife, more engaged, trying to get people taking action for nature. We kind of joke that the ultimate goal of the Cheshire Wildlife Trust is to not have to exist anymore. The idea is that if everyone is doing our work, then we don't need to do it anymore. Unfortunately, we still do. There's a lot of work to be done. But we're kind of very broad, I'd say, in the work that we do and our reach. We're always trying to represent all of Cheshire as much as we can, though we have certain kind of areas kind of landscapes that we focus on. And so out in East Cheshire, we kind of focus on the Pennine Fringe. We have one of our big focus areas along the River Gowie in West Cheshire. So we kind of work all over with everyone who will work with us. And my role kind of fits a bit more broadly into the advocacy work that we do. I'm in a new kind of team that's the advocacy team, and we're kind of trying to figure out what that is and what that means and what advocacy actually looks like. Though my role hasn't changed too much because I'm the planning and advocacy officer. But a lot of what I do is planning and policy, basically. So one of the big threats to wildlife everywhere in the world, but also very much in Cheshire, is habitat loss. And so it's areas that used to be kind of left for nature that we have decided to take to do all the different things we do with land. So, for agriculture, for industry, for housing development. And so I kind of focus on where areas of wildlife are at threat from development mainly. So that's housing and infrastructure, kind of anything. And so I kind of work within the planning system, which is it's a set of policies and legislation at the national level and the local level that kind of inform how development should happen. And so it's kind of about making sure that development happens in the right way and in the right place. And that kind of involves thinking about how it's affecting nature and wildlife. So if they're planning to build 100 or 200 houses somewhere, it's important that they look at what's there and whether there are important species or important habitats that might be displaced or destroyed if the houses are built there. And so my role specifically is to advocate for the wildlife that's there, because unfortunately they cannot advocate for themselves very easily. And so it's a lot of work around kind of trying to work with developers to adapt their plans and designs to kind of incorporate nature as much as possible. Where they're not being very responsive, it's also about objecting to planning applications a lot of the time. And then kind of trying to influence policy, especially local policy, at kind of the local authority level or the parish level sometimes as well, to try to get better policies for nature that are going to protect them kind of from the outset.
It's quite a lot a lot of different areas of your work. And I was kind of thinking when you said the first thing and you were saying that, it's about working with, say, property developers to make sure that they're taking things into account and stuff, I was going to be like, what does that involve? What's a day in your life? And then you listed all these other things, and I was like, maybe I should do a week in your life. But when you are kind of engaging, did the people reach out to you? So do you find that the property developers reach out to you because of legislation and things and they want guidance? Or are you kind of having to be the proactive ones going to them? And obviously you were saying about objecting to planning permission kind of notices and things like that, but when you're kind of trying to work with them, is that you going to them going to you, a bit of both? How does it work?
It really depends on their willingness to kind of do it right by nature. So sometimes we do get developers reaching out to us, either for advice or to kind of make sure that we agree with their plans. Ultimately, it's a bit of a faff for developers to have planning objections against their applications. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the one small leverage that I have. And so it really is in their interest to reach out to us and make sure that we are kind of happy with their plans. And we've had some really good examples of developers actually changing their design based on our advice, based on, there's a habitat that is really important or is really rare, that it would be, it would be a shame to have it be destroyed, and where they've actually managed to kind of incorporate it into their design. A lot of the time it is me reaching out, because we're not quite there yet. But then I also work quite a bit with the local authorities themselves, so the ones making the decisions on the planning applications, and kind of trying to influence that way as well.
It's like, again, there's like so much to it, because I mean, especially in the current climate with housing targets by the government, I can imagine that now more than ever you'll kind of come across more and more different developments that are planned, obviously, to reach these targets that the government has set on that front, but also that can add a lot of challenges for you in your work, managing, because how do you even, just from my perspective, I'd be like, how would you find out about every single request for planning permission? Are you just filtering to look for like the largest ones? Are you just literally on the web, like the council website, like a normal resident would be, or do you have access to some special databases? How do you find, even in the first place, where these things are happening?
Yeah, do not get me started on the planning portals. I spend a lot of my time on there. If I have some downtime, if I don't have too much on, I'll just go and kind of trawl through all the planning applications. And I have my gripes with some of the planning portals that don't make it particularly easy to do my job. But so it's about, I've kind of gotten pretty good at figuring out which applications are going to require my attention. And so there are kind of a few things that I look for. Definitely bigger housing applications. I'm not going to bother with a household extension or even just a few houses built, especially if it's in an already really urbanized environment. But usually a lot of the bigger developments are out kind of on the edges of towns and villages. And so that's where there might be some good wildlife, a brook that hasn't been too impacted yet, or some good grassland. And so I'll look at whether there are what we call priority habitats, so habitats that are more rare or important. And then I also, one of the big things I check for is whether there's a local wildlife site there. So those are sites that we have identified through various means as being good for nature, in that it's kind of survived this long, basically. And so, as I say, it could be a grassland that hasn't been plowed up, in 50 years, or a patch of woodland that hasn't been impacted. And so we kind of participate in designating those as local wildlife sites. And then part of our job, a big part of our job, is making sure that those are not built on, that they're not destroyed, and in fact, actually, ideally, that they are well managed for nature.
Yeah, that seems like a much more logical way than I was like, you have to look at every single thing that ever comes through.
No, there are a few processes, yeah.
And I'm sure there's a few of you, but there's probably not enough to look at every single one.
No, I am the only one in my team specifically looking at planning.
Yeah,
so I'm kind of
a big role.
I very much have to prioritize. Yeah, so it's bigger housing applications, and actually with the new housing targets that the government set, we're finding bigger and bigger housing developments coming forward. And then it's also, a big part of it is these, what they call national significant infrastructure projects. So like solar farms, wind farms, roads, rail lines, and stuff like that, which those, because of their scale, have potential to have a really big impact on wildlife.
So how do you anticipate and kind of plan for those kind of things? Because you kind of don't know until it's officially announced, do you, that this is happening? And obviously with changes in government and the new government, they've had different things they've introduced, and I mean, like, just certain big rail projects like HS2, it's happening, then it's not, and how do you kind of prepare for those kind of changes that could really impact the work that you're doing at the Wildlife Trust?
So a big part of it is staying up on top of policy and legislation. The bigger the project, the more, in theory, the more regulation there is to make sure that the impacts are understood and avoided or mitigated for or compensated for if necessary. And so the big housing applications usually have to do an environmental impact assessment, for example. And so that's kind of the first step. So if I see that they have asked the council whether they need to do one of those, that kind of signifies to me that that's one to keep an eye out for when the application actually comes in. And then for in big infrastructure projects, what they call the pre-application period is usually several years. And so that's the time when we are trying to engage with the developers, trying to, provide advice and try to negotiate changing the design if necessary. And so that usually has kind of a bigger lead-up time. And in fact, that's the time at which most of our work is being done, because hopefully by the end of that process, we don't have to put in an objection, though sometimes we still do. But
so you're involved from quite early on then, which
ideally
help. Okay.
Sometimes we're not, and then it's really, really difficult to influence. Yeah,
I can imagine. So the earlier you can find out what's going on and get involved in those pre-application stages, like you're mentioning, the easier it is for you to influence and make sure that the right thing's happening with nature in mind.
Yeah, definitely.
But I guess, it's such an important work, and people, obviously, there's a housing crisis in the UK, but there's a lot of mixed emotions about it, and there's still a lot of uncertainty because obviously there's going to be some changes into the rules surrounding how nature has to be taken into account because they're trying to speed up the process of these developments, and that is something that I can imagine might be challenging for you as well.
Definitely.
The Wildlife Trust. Definitely.
There's so many factors at play, really, and everyone has a different aspect of it that they care about, because a lot of people are really concerned about the housing crisis and having affordable housing. In my job, I have to focus on the wildlife. But then personally, I'm also very conflicted with all of these different facets of it. And in fact, the big infrastructure projects have been particularly difficult because a lot of them are for renewable energy, which the government is really pushing, their net zero agenda, and which is great because we need to be decarbonizing, but not at the expense of wildlife and of nature, because ultimately the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are so interlinked, and if we try to fix one at the expense of the other, we're not going to get anywhere. And so that's one of the things that we really have to kind of fight for, but we don't want to be seen as anti-net zero, obviously. And it's tough because a lot of people are a lot more aware of the climate crisis than the biodiversity crisis, and everyone wants renewable energy and cheaper energy. And so ultimately, sometimes I just have to focus on the wildlife because that's what I'm here for. And if developers are trying to build this infrastructure at the expense of nature, then that's where I kind of take issue with it.
So in terms of the nature side, which is obviously where your work focuses, is really interesting to hear you bring up the kind of conflict that you have sometimes with like these renewable energy projects, which are another facet of kind of the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, like you were saying. The two are interlinked, but sometimes focus can be more on one than the other, but actually they're both things you care about. But in your role, obviously, at the Wildlife Trust, that is your focus. But in terms of like these big developments, and you're saying partly it comes to where they are located. So if it's like a particularly important site, you don't want them to be there. You want that to stay a protected area. But if they are being built somewhere, what are things that you might suggest to the developers to make places more nature friendly? What kinds of things, when you're in that process of communication with them, can you bring up that they can do and they can implement?
So I will say for housing developments, it's actually a lot easier than infrastructure projects, or maybe they're more willing to do it. In part because people like having nature outside their house.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping one of the things that housing developers start seeing more and more is that having integrating wildlife into their developments actually is going to make for a better development. But so in that sense, there's so many things they can do, and that we're really seeing that they're doing. A lot of big developments are kind of incorporating an open space nature park where they're planting trees, ideally enhancing habitats that are already there, planting wildflower meadows and things like that. And the things that people want outside their house. And it really just requires setting a little bit aside. So that might be building, 10 fewer houses. But ultimately, it's really going to benefit nature, and it's going to benefit the people who live there, and ideally the people who live in the surrounding area as well. For bigger infrastructure projects, it's tough because they're really trying to maximize their output, and the two are often seen as kind of opposing. But it's the same kind of thing where, planting some wildflower meadows will go a long way for pollinators, especially if the area is not very well connected in terms of its nature network. But ultimately, for big infrastructure projects, it is really about not putting them in places where there's already good nature. And that's been kind of one of the difficult things about these big projects, is that often they need a lot of space. And so they'll find the areas where that aren't already urbanized or don't already have, agriculture. And that is often where nature is. Yeah. It's often kind of seen as, that's empty space that can be used for development. And it's really not. It's about shifting our mindset to see that as extremely valuable, because it's actually one of the resources that we are losing the fastest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, I was kind of mentioning the property side, focusing on that before, but when you're saying about all the infrastructure stuff, when you think about it, like a huge motorway or something being built and how it just disrupts the landscape. So something I've talked about before, the other kind of people from the sector who have come on, is just having that pathway for nature to kind of move. So even I've had Frog Life on before, who are a charity that look at the protection of frogs and amphibian species in the UK, and it's not like the frogs aren't okay by themselves. It's the fact that they have a route that they go along every single year, and the toads have this specific route that they go along. They migrate back to the pond that they were born in, but actually if a road goes in the way, they can't get there. So what you're then doing is you are eliminating, because they'll still try and go that way, and they can't get over the road. So you're eliminating a whole group of animals, a whole group of species in an area. And you've mentioned so many times in the show, because everything's interlinked, it just has this huge impact. I can definitely understand how infrastructure is a huge challenge that you face.
And it can be particularly tough when the developers don't really seem to understand this or care very much, because sometimes it's just about really little things. It's about incorporating it kind of into the design in the early stages, because that's where it can have a lot of impact. But if they're not thinking about these things, the effects that they have on the natural environment can be particularly can be really destructive. And there is, a decent amount of legislation in place to make sure this doesn't happen. But right now that's often being kind of rolled back a little bit. Sometimes it's kind of ignored. And a lot of times it's just not done in the spirit of trying to help nature.
Yeah, definitely. I guess there's lots of pressures on different people, and unfortunately nature is something that we often see suffer when in reality it should really be the top priority, because it affects everything else ultimately. But we don't, unfortunately, always see that. Do you ever kind of work with on these kind of big projects where like a road might go through a few regions, you've obviously said that the Cheshire Wildlife Trust, you're in Cheshire obviously, and that you generally have a wildlife trust in every county.
Yeah.
Is there ever cross kind of organisation working to really kind of make an impact on these big projects?
Yeah, absolutely. So especially with these bigger infrastructure projects, a lot of the time they have impact multiple counties. One of our big projects at the moment is around the Mersey tidal barrage. I don't know if you've heard of it. They are planning to put a tidal barrage across the Mersey River, so kind of between Liverpool and Birkenhead. And a lot of people don't know this, but the Mersey River and the Mersey estuary in particular that's kind of between Liverpool and Runcorn. That area is extremely important for nature, for wildlife. It's an internationally designated wetland site because it hosts hundreds of thousands of migratory birds as kind of a feeding ground. These are birds that are coming from Canada, from Siberia, from all over Europe, and so it's a really important site at an international level. And one of the things that makes it kind of unique is that it's an estuary, and so it's really dependent on the tides, on the tidal cycle. And as I was talking about earlier, when it comes to these kinds of ecosystems, if you disrupt one thing, it ends up disrupting it all. And so in this case, if you disrupt the tides, it has the potential to impact the feeding grounds for these birds and the fish and all of the different species that use this area. And so as I was talking about, trying to work with developers, the developers for this barrage have not been particularly kind of forthcoming, and they've set up these consultation groups, but none of the NGOs really feel like we're being listened to. And so we're launching a campaign actually against the barrage because, I think we're going to need a lot of public support on this one to try to save the Mersey estuary. But to get back to your question, actually, we're working really closely with the Lancashire Wildlife Trust because they're just on the other side of the estuary. And so this will be impacting them, and they represent the Liverpool City region and North Merseyside in general. And so we're kind of working with them on the campaign side. And then my kind of planning counterpart there, we've been working really closely together to kind of go through the really big reports and attending the consultation meetings and trying to advocate. And it's just so much more effective when we can kind of split resources, especially because each trust is very different because we're all independent charities. And so each trust is very different in the way that they're organized and the roles that they have. And so they are Lancashire Wildlife Trust are really strong on social media, for example, but they don't have quite as many resources dedicated specifically to planning in the way that I do it. And so collaboration means that we can kind of pool our strengths to work on these kinds of projects.
Yeah, and it definitely sounds like it's a huge project
that
you're working on. So you need all the kind of resources you can get. And that must be a really hard part of your work where you're coming into conflict all the time with something that is, the government or whoever is saying this is needed for something, but it's having it will have a humongous impact on the nature in the area. And I didn't know all of that about the River Mersey, so it's really interesting to hear. And it goes through such a large region. A lot of people have a connection to it in some way. It's
a tough one, and we're kind of part of our campaign, which we've launched recently, but are kind of, constantly working on, is trying to talk to communities about their relationship with the Mersey River. It's tough because it's not a very picturesque river, especially around the estuary and around Liverpool and Runcorn, because it's so heavily industrialized. The whole region obviously is very industrial, but along the Mersey particularly. And so people don't look at it and see oh, what amazing nature this is. But actually the birds are still there, despite all of the industry and despite all the pollution. Though actually the river itself has made really good recovery. It used to be one of the most polluted rivers in the UK, I think. And now I went to a forum recently where I learned that there's 69 species of fish in the Mersey River, which is a lot of fish. And they were saying when they started monitoring back in the 90s, there were they had 4 species of fish. Yeah, made a really good recovery.
Yeah, in quite a short space of time.
Yes, so that's a really good example of the kind of conservation work that's being done by local groups too. They're people are monitoring and are restoring habitats. And it can have a really big impact. That's all it really takes.
Yeah, and having that kind of research from the monitoring side of stuff must be really helpful for you when you're advocating for stuff, because you can say, look,
definitely,
this is how many species of fish there are.
Yeah,
these are how many birds are found here.
Yeah, because we don't do a whole lot of research at the trust. And that's kind of one of the things that we're looking to do more, I think, is partnering with research institutions. Because one of our one of the ways in which we really try to work is being evidence-led, but that requires having the evidence. And there's a lot of good research being done. Again, as I say, especially by local groups who are doing all these monitoring efforts and doing transects and out volunteering to kind of make sure that there are constant assessments of what's there, and in some cases, a lot of cases, what we're losing as well.
Yeah, I guess you're going to see that all the time, but it's really nice when you can, when people have done that monitoring and you do see an increase and you can see the positive impact.
The positive trends are really nice to hear about.
I can imagine. And you at the very beginning, when we were talking about the kind of broader work, the Cheshire Wildlife Trust, you said you have like a couple of key areas of focus in West Cheshire and East Cheshire, and I guess those are the regions where you're really working hard and hopefully you will, or you already do, see the positive impacts.
Well, it's kind of, I think, part of the idea of focusing on certain bigger landscapes is because, well, just the benefit of doing it at a larger scale, because wildlife really thrives when it has larger areas, because smaller, more fragmented bits are generally not good for nature. And so we're kind of trying to work at this landscape scale, but it also means that we can kind of try new things and then try to get landowners on board. And so if landowners see the impact that the conservation work is having around them, then they kind of join in, and it has this kind of snowball effect of getting larger and larger areas kind of managed for nature.
Yeah, which is, I mean, you wish people didn't have to see things to take an interest, but it does play into it.
In a lot of cases, we're asking people to kind of change the way that they do things. Because the reason we're in this situation is because we kind of have lost sight of working with nature. And so especially with landowners and farmers, for example, we're kind of asking them to change their practices and change the way that they have been doing things. And so they definitely need some proof, some certainty that it's going to work, that it's going to have an impact. And so if we can kind of do that work and showcase the benefits and the nature-based solutions that we're using to kind of solve these bigger problems, like flooding and loss of biodiversity, then it kind of makes it easier for people to get on board.
Absolutely. And in terms of the nature-based solutions, how, obviously, like when we were talking before, you mentioned ways that like the housing developers can have a smaller impact by incorporating things like wildflower meadows, building a few less homes and having a bit more green space in their projects and things like that. Where do you obviously there's some things that are maybe common sense to you guys that you've always known, but how do you kind of keep pushing and moving forwards and kind of coming up with new ideas? Do you kind of look what people have done in different areas, internationally even? Do you kind of do research into what has been effective kind of approaches for restoration and recovery, or do you kind of work them out almost by trial and error on top of the stuff you're already doing?
So I'd say a lot of the trial and errors may be being done and devised at a more national level, because we don't really have the funds to be trying things to see if they work. And so a lot of the nature-based solutions, for example, that we're advocating for are pretty standard, I'd say. And so for housing developments, I will say there's also a lot of, increasingly, there's more and more legislation around making sure that housing developments are sustainable and incorporate these nature-based solutions. And so sustainable urban draining systems, SUDs, are being incorporated into essentially all new housing developments. And it makes a lot of sense because it's just going to be cheaper to manage, and it provides an opportunity for, a little pond, like for some wildlife as well. There's talk about green roofs and green walls and stuff, and then just generally planting trees for shade. I think those are kind of the more urban measures. And then kind of on a larger scale, there's this kind of increase in funding for wetland creation to mitigate flooding, which is obviously one of the big issues around climate change in the UK. And that is one of the things that we are doing more and more, mostly getting funding for more and more. And that is still a little bit of trial and error, but clearly enough to, for big agencies to give us funding for that kind of stuff. So those are some kind of bigger projects that we're working on.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear. And you were saying that some of the more trial and error stuff is done on the national level. How do the local trusts link into the national organisation?
Yeah. So we have a national team across kind of the different works that we do. So there's a national team for campaigns and for communities, for planning. So in my role, for example, we have a planning working group once a month with the national team, and that's an opportunity for all the different trusts to feed in to the work that the national team are doing, which is a lot of kind of lobbying and trying to influence legislation and policy at a national level. They're talking to ministers, and they have a pretty good presence in kind of higher up. And so on our part, it's more we try to do a lot of like case studies. I've written up a few about the work that I've done or the difficult projects I've had, and kind of the national team kind of gather all of those and try to figure out what is working and what isn't working so that they can do some targeted advocacy.
That's really interesting to hear, because I think people know about the Wildlife Trust in the region and then they know about the national one. So it's useful to know how they kind of help you guys link in together, and then you're helping, I guess, not being the person who's directly doing the lobbying, but from your experience, then you're informing them, which is, I'm sure, invaluable to them. And
it also, so we kind of call ourselves a movement, and it's a really good way to make sure that we're kind of sharing resources. I think apparently I heard this at one of the kind of Wildlife Trust conventions I went to recently, that we're actually one of the biggest conservation organizations in Europe. Wow. Based on our size and our reach. Because if you think about it, we're all over the UK. Yeah. And so each individual charity is relatively small for a conservation organization, but as a whole, we have a lot of influence, and we're both really connected kind of nationally at a higher level, but also we are really in it. We're really talking with local communities and, getting people out in nature at a very small scale as well. And it also means that we can, as I said, kind of share resources across trusts. And so different trusts have their strengths. And so it means that if we kind of want to set up a new strategy for something, we can talk to other trusts who have tried that. Or if we have new big projects, there's likely another trust who's done something similar. And I've gotten a lot of advice when I'm really stuck on a project or like how to deal with something. We have kind of this platform where we can, it's kind of like a Wildlife Trust social media where we can connect with other people who have similar roles to ask for people's advice.
That's really cool, and it's incredible that you're one of the largest in wildlife organisations in Europe.
I'm pretty sure. I have to fact check that, but yeah. But I think it's what's unique about the Wildlife Trust is that we are both a national organization and a very local one, because those like WWF and Rewilding Europe have maybe a bit less local reach. Like they'll do local projects, but they're less kind of embedded in the communities that they're working with, I think.
It does sound like a really advantageous position that you're in, because you've got that connection, like you're saying, on that really small scale, and then I guess you're building up to that national kind of higher level scale where you're not kind of hands in the ground, but you're making that impact. So that does sound like a really actually great setup for you as an organisation, definitely, and for you guys to learn off each other.
Yeah,
absolutely. So look, it's been really interesting hearing about the work of the Trust, your role in the Trust as well. A lot of people to think about who have been listening. I've learned a lot already, to be honest.
I've dumped a lot of information.
No, but in such an interesting and engaging way. And it's kind of, I think, brought to light things that not everyone is going to have thought of. When they think about the challenges that wildlife is facing just at that local level. We might all have a kind of rough gauge of it, but actually understanding the work you're doing in your role, the challenges you're facing, has been really interesting, just to build up that picture of what it's like, and why your work's important, and how you're going about doing it, because I mean you're doing something for everyone in the role that you're doing, whether people realise it or not. But that's been really great talking about. So what we'll do is we will have a quick break, we'll have some more music, and then we will come back for a final section where we have had a few questions sent in advance of the show. So we will go through a few of those and then we will round up. So we will be back in just a moment. Hello and welcome back to the Earth Show here with me, Elysia, joined today by Mélusine from the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. It's been such an interesting show, and we were having actually a really interesting conversation in the break just then. I know we're running out of time for the show, but just about kind of how people's attitudes have changed over time, and you were saying about the amount that the trust has grown in size
since. Really, I think between pre-COVID and now, we've doubled in size, and I think part of that just shows how much more people are thinking about nature and interested and willing to kind of fund our work. Yeah,
absolutely. We have some wonderful questions sent in from listeners that we, of course, going to ask. We probably are not going to have time to get through all of them, but we'll try and get through a few. We'll try and get through them a bit quickly, so we'll give you some shorter answers, perhaps.
Not try.
No pressure. Just so we can get through a few of them, and then we shall round up today. First one I've got here is, how are you funded at the Wildlife Trust?
Yeah, so one of the, and this might come up as well, the challenges of conservation is always funding. I think this is true for charities in general, obviously. So part of our funding is grants that we receive, that we apply for different projects. And then another like main source of funding is people donating and people becoming members of the Wildlife Trust. We really rely on people making donations, either for certain projects or kind of regularly as members. So this is a little plug to look into the work that we do and see if you can sign up and become a member, because the work that we do really wouldn't be possible without our supporters.
Absolutely. And that kind of links on to the next question I've got down, which is, do you have any voluntary roles? So I guess...
Yeah, we have loads of ways of getting involved as a volunteer. We have volunteers who work on our reserves to do kind of the manual labor of conservation. So removing invasive species, planting trees. We have volunteer days as well. And then we have a lot of volunteers who help us kind of get people involved in communities as well. And there are also a lot of local groups that we work with, so absolutely tons of ways to get involved in the work that we do.
That's brilliant to hear. And where can people find out about those? Where can they get the information if they are interested?
Yeah, we have, all of our information is on the Cheshire Wildlife Trust website. I'm not going to give the address. You can just Google it. And then if you want to get in contact with us over specific things, specific issues, if you have land that you want to rewild, definitely contact us. We have a bunch of different email addresses that you can contact us at on the website.
Next question I've got is, which we've kind of covered, but we can go for it just briefly again, is more of your time spent looking at protecting small areas, or is everything done on a big picture level?
I think it depends on the work, on the role at the trust. So as I said, some of my colleagues work on specific reserves. So those can be small areas or larger areas, actually. As I said, we also have kind of landscape scale projects that we're working on. Ultimately, I don't know if there's really a way of differentiating the two, because even the large scale projects are kind of composed of smaller areas. A lot of it has to do with landowners. And so a larger landscape work project is often composed of smaller areas that we can kind of join up and link together. And then in my work personally, it's again a mix. So it'll depend on the size of the development, basically. Yeah.
So quite a mix of different focuses. And final question before we end today's show is, someone's asked, what is the best type of wildlife we get in Chester? Oh, I think maybe Chester.
In Cheshire, yeah.
In your opinion, after working for the Wildlife Trust?
That's kind of tough. It's funny, actually, because a lot of the work that I do is more focused on habitats. I think we're moving a little bit away from focusing on individual species, because habitats are composed of lots of different species. But personally, I am very partial to water voles, and they're one of the species that I've had to advocate for quite a bit in the work that I do, because you often find them in watercourses, so rivers, brooks, ditches if they're in good condition. But because our waterways are so polluted, they're declining at really crazy rates. And so there's still a few kind of water vole strongholds, but they face so many challenges. They're also predated on by mink, which are invasive species from North America. And so they're a tough one to kind of get populations up and going again. But they're so sweet, and they're really, to me, they're kind of one of the species that I really think about in Cheshire. So
that's really nice. It's a nice question to end the show on. And with that being said, we have run out of time, so we are going to have to wrap it up. But thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's been so lovely having you. You've been a really great guest, really interesting, really knowledgeable. And I've loved having you on. So thank you for your time.
I really appreciate being here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all so much for listening to today's episode of The Earth Show. Your support really does mean so much, and I'd be so grateful if you could leave a review, a rating, a comment if you enjoyed listening today. And don't forget to follow or subscribe to our podcast on here, and follow at @theearth_show for more content on Instagram as well. And if you'd like to get in touch, I'd love to hear from you on info.theearthshow@gmail.com. But in the meantime, all that's left to say is don't forget to share this podcast with your friends if you've enjoyed it today. And from me, a massive thank you for listening, and have a wonderful week. Speak to you soon.